Welcome. This is a short course called Negotiating Sustainability. It focuses on building consensus on environmental protection, economic development, and social welfare trade-offs. My name is Larry Susskind. I'm Ford Professor of Urban and Environmental Planning at MIT. Often, people think of sustainability as a scientific concept, but in fact, sustainable development needs to be, and usually is, the product of negotiations. That is, negotiations amongst groups in the society with conflicting interests. These differences or interests come into play whenever trade-offs have to be made between environmental protection, economic development, and social welfare. The fact of the matter is, whenever we talk about sustainable development, whether we're talking about corporate decisions, public agency decisions, or decisions made in civil society, we are talking about trade-offs. Thus, we're talking about negotiation. Let me illustrate what I mean by the negotiations involved in sustainable development decision-making. I'm going to use as an example the first of its kind offshore wind farm proposal that's currently under consideration in the northeastern part of the United States. This is a project proposed by a private corporation that wants permission from the federal government to build in federal waters. It would involve the construction of more than 130 turbines, each 4 or 5 feet tall, that would generate electricity from wind. The electricity would be brought by cable to the electrical grid in the state onshore. Now, there's a lot of differing opinion on whether or not this should be built. Even the environmentalists are split. Some environmentalists are worried about the impact of these giant blades on the bird population. Some environmentalists are worried about the possible impact of building this facility in federal waters about 7 miles offshore on the whale population. Fishermen are worried about the effect on the fish population. People who live on the island nearest to this location, who have expensive summer homes and who live there year-round, are concerned about the aesthetic impact of looking off the beach and suddenly seeing this set of turbines several miles offshore. The state government is split. The governor is against it. Others within his own administration think promoting sustainable development through renewable energy is an important thing to do. The federal government is split. Some members of the Congress representing people in the areas nearest to the facility are worried about the project because of its environmental and aesthetic impacts. Others are worried about the federal government allowing a private company to use federal waters to generate a profit, even though they would generate it from green electricity. So we have a variety of views, some who are in favor of the project because it would avoid the need to new power plants, would be in favor of the wind farm if they knew that that would avoid the air pollution impacts of new facilities. We have all these different views. Is building a renewable energy producing plant sustainable? Well, from an environmental standpoint, it would have many desirable features, but until there's more information, people aren't sure of the impacts on bird life and aquatic life. Is it desirable from an economic standpoint? Well, it's possible, especially if you value all the pollution impacts of generating additional power in traditional ways. Is it desirable from a social welfare perspective? Well, that depends on whether you're one of the people who lives on the nearby island and thinks you could attach value to the aesthetics, or you're a sailor who's worried about the environmental or aesthetic impact of these large turbines when you're out sailing. The federal government is supposed to review this project from the standpoint of navigation. Will it have an impact on navigation, especially at night? So it's not clear whether or not we can say for a fact that a wind farm offshore is sustainable. The only way we can make that judgment is to bring all these different perspectives together and to consider them side by side. What would the ideal setting be to undertake the negotiations, for example, concerning the offshore wind farm proposal? Ideally, scientists would be there to begin to document the long-term and the short-term impacts of both the immediate effects of building the wind farm, the short-term construction effects on fish life, the long-term effects on fish and birds, the comparable effects of building new power plants and the pollution from those, and the pollution avoided if we built with renewable wind. We bring together all the stakeholders, all the groups concerned about this, with the scientists to do the analysis of the economic effects, the social welfare effects, and the ecological or environmental effects. Can you think of a forum like that that's been created when important projects have taken place in the settings or the country that you know best? In the United States, we often imagine that the environmental impact assessment process is providing a forum of this sort. Under our national law and pursuant to global treaties, we have a requirement that whenever anyone proposes to build, groups that are concerned to participate in a review of those predictions and a discussion about mitigation possibilities. Let's talk about the creation of appropriate forums in which trade-offs leading to sustainable development decisions can be made. I want to suggest the most important considerations in the trade-off decision that has to be made would choose their own representatives to participate in a discussion and ultimately in a joint decision. Secondly, instead of everybody bringing their own technical information and challenging everyone else's technical information, the scientific information, forecasts, analyses needed would be developed jointly by the stakeholders. So we're bringing representatives chosen by the stakeholders to present their interests. They're jointly developing the information they need, and they would address a range of issues sufficiently broad to cover the things that they were all concerned about. Right now, a lot of sustainable development decision-making takes place on one dimension at a time and in a very narrow framework. What we need are forums that can take on multidimensional aspects of projects and their long-term as well as their short-term impacts. Let's use another example to think again about forums for the sustainable development decision-making. Think about national energy policy in your country. One way of charting national energy policy is to make what we call a pie chart, a circle, and it's divided up proportionately to show the supply of energy for all the different uses in the country for a given year. So you would have energy from oil, energy from gas, and so on. And then you would have a second circle showing demand, all the uses to which all that energy is put. Again, a pie chart, and it would show the distribution of uses for different sectoral purposes. And of course, the two pie charts would be the same size, or you would try to make them the same size so that you'd have energy produced and energy utilized equaling each other. And to make an energy policy into the future, you'd make a set of pie charts for a date in the future, say 25 years ahead. And you'd have those two circles with whatever you're forecasting as the distribution of supply of energy from different sources and the distribution of demand at that date for the different uses of energy. And then you'd have to say what were the steps by which the country would get from the current pattern of supply and demand to the future pattern of supply and demand. And in making those judgments, all of the stakeholders and all of the analysts would say, well, what are the costs associated with moving from one set of pie charts to another? What are the impacts? What are the impacts on different groups, the social welfare implications? And what are the ecological implications? And again, if you had all the stakeholders there and you could have such a conversation, you would, in the end, produce a future set of pie charts that adjusted for the trade-offs that had to be made between environmental protection, economic well-being, and social well-being. Big question, of course, is who would represent all the stakeholder groups? Which stakeholder groups would you want to see represented? And how would the trade-offs or the balancing take place? The construction and management of forums for the discussion of the trade-offs involved in sustainable development planning and decision-making goes by the name of multi-stakeholder dialogues. If you want to read more about multi-stakeholder dialogues, you might want to look at a book by Minu Hemmati, Hemmati. The book's called Multi-Stakeholder Processes for Governance and Sustainability, published by Earthscan in 2002. There is both a theory and a practice. We know the UN Commission on Sustainable Development has managed such multi-stakeholder dialogues on a global scale for quite a few years. We also have wonderful examples of multi-stakeholder dialogues being managed nationally on sustainable development. The roundtable process in Canada is a great example. What we know from the study of these national and international MSDs, multi-stakeholder dialogues, is that their success depends on getting the right parties to the table, providing effective process management or facilitation so that a large number of people can talk together efficiently, ensuring adequate scientific and technical input, and finding some way to ensure that the recommendations that come out of these processes are actually implemented, that these informal negotiations lead to formal action. I now want to introduce you to another concept, one that I call super optimality. Super optimality is, well, it's kind of a contradictory term, right? Optimization is optimization. How can you have super optimization? Well, when I think about the forums or multi-stakeholder dialogues involved in planning for sustainable development, and I think about the ground rules or criteria that these MSDs ought to use in making policy decisions, in choosing amongst trade-offs, I think in terms of super optimality. That is, imagine you were a member of one of these forums and a bundle of proposals, policy proposals, were before the group. What if we said there was a decision rule that however much you wanted to achieve economic growth or economic development, if that was what your group was most concerned about, you could only make proposals that achieved economic growth and development that also improved environmental quality and improved social welfare, that is, helped the poorest of the poor achieve a better life. You couldn't just advocate for a set of trade-offs good along one dimension that maximized what you wanted along the dimension favored by you. You would also have to think of a way of achieving what was most important to you while also achieving these other objectives. Super-optimality as a decision-making criterion would say to any forum arranged to make decisions about sustainability, no matter who's participating, the group as a whole cannot just seek to optimize from each member's own perspective, but they must pursue the multiple dimensions of sustainability. I now want to introduce a third concept, the concept of consensus, or consensus building. Imagine we've gotten the relevant stakeholders together. They've undertaken a process of joint fact-finding, so they're not spending all their time criticizing each other's technical input. They're committed to super-optimization to the extent that they can understand that. And what if we added another rule to the operations of the forum? That the only policy recommendations that would be taken seriously from the forum with regard to the trade-offs involved in sustainable development would be those that reflected a consensus, a nearly unanimous agreement amongst the participants. Think of those contexts in which you've seen groups achieve nearly unanimous agreement. First of all, that rarely can be achieved or accomplished without somebody managing the discussion who's accepted by all the parties. But secondly, consensus only comes about when you say there won't be any voting. We're going to keep working until we get very close to or achieve agreement, unanimity. We're going to strive for unanimity, although we settle for something very close to it. Those groups that seek unanimity, they may take a straw vote to see how they're doing. But if the group knows there's no agreement, unless they come close to satisfying everyone, then each person in the group works particularly hard to come up with something that's good for them and good for the others that they've had to listen to and whose interests they've had to take seriously in the course of the conversation. And I realize in highly politicized contexts it may seem difficult to achieve unanimity, and in situations in which power is distributed unevenly, it may seem hard to imagine that we can achieve unanimity. But you need to realize that most global forums, the United Nations, global treaties on hundreds of different subjects, don't take votes. They operate by consensus. We could do the same thing nationally. In any forum to make a decision about sustainability, we could say, we're going to try to operate by consensus. We're going to have a neutral process manager. We're going to precede decision-making with joint fact-finding. First of all, that rarely can be achieved or accomplished without somebody managing the discussion who's accepted by all the parties. But secondly, consensus only comes about when you say there won't be any voting. We're going to keep working until we get very close to or achieve agreement, unanimity. We're going to strive for unanimity, although we settle for something very close to it. Those groups that seek unanimity, they may take a straw vote to see how they're doing. But if the group knows there's no agreement, unless they come close to satisfying everyone, then each person in the group works particularly hard to come up with something that's good for them and good for the others that they've had to listen to and whose interests they've had to take seriously in the course of the conversation. And I realize in highly politicized context it may seem difficult to achieve unanimity, and in situations in which power is distributed unevenly, it may seem hard to imagine that we can achieve unanimity. But you need to realize that most global forums, the United Nations, global treaties on hundreds of different subjects, you can see the 5 conclusions that round out this short course. I think that as students, you might want to try the following. Analyze a major decision in your country that should have been looked at from a sustainable development perspective. Imagine the kind of forum that might have been organized to make that decision, or at least advise those with the authority to make that decision. You might even try to simulate it in a class. That is, each person assume that they represent one of the key stakeholding groups, do some homework, come together, imagine you were in such a dialogue. And if you're going to try to do that, set some ground rules for yourself. What might that decision have been if you had accepted a consensus rule? What would that decision have been like if you sought to super-optimize as a group of people representing all the key stakeholding groups in the country? What if you had undertaken joint fact-finding so that you had a common base of forecasts and information to work from? If that simulation interests you, you could also look at the web page of the Program on Negotiation at the Harvard Law School, www.pon.harvard.edu. Look at the clearinghouse and look at all the simulations you can actually download and use in class to have the factual briefing books for each party playing one of the different roles in one of these hypothetical forums. My sense is that it's up to the next generation of scholars and leaders to say if sustainability is going to be taken seriously, it will affect how decisions get made at the national and regional and local level on major projects and policies that affect the sustainability of the development that proceeds. If you have questions or if you want additional readings, don't hesitate to email me. Again, my name is Larry Susskind, and my email is Susskind, SUSSKIND, @MIT.edu, and I'll do my best to continue the dialogue with you about the management of sustainability. Thanks for listening.